families to donate to this great cause as well. The easiest way to donate is through our Enthuse page. You can see the details on the screen. And if you need any help, please get in touch with a member of our fundraising team at fundraising@redr.org.uk. And just to tell you a bit more about our session today, so shortly I will hand it over to our CEO, Joe DeSerrano. Joe will tell you more about some of our recent projects that we've been working on, our plans for the future. She will also talk about our response to the war in Ukraine. And today we're also joined by Dr. Lee Ashley Lipscomb, our humanitarian consultant and a member of RedR since 2015. Lee Ashley has more than 15 years of experience working on protection, gender-based violence, and human rights. She's a former UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations staff member and a member of the Interagency Standing Committee, Gen CAP. She's currently delivering our training on gender-based violence in situations of armed conflict as a part of our Ukraine response. Lee Ashley will talk about humanitarian work in more general terms, what is that humanitarians do and why their work is so important, and also about some current trends in humanitarian work. At the end of the session, we'll have some time for a short Q&A session, so you can post your questions either in the chat box or you can ask them at the end. And we expect session to last about 45 minutes. It will also be recorded, so if you'd like to watch it later or share it with anyone who wasn't able to attend today. And now I will hand it over to Joe DeSerrano, CEO. So Joe.
Great, thank you. So first, just wanted to say a big welcome to everyone who's taken the time to join online. It's gratefully appreciated. Your support of RedR is wonderful, and I can't thank you enough. For those of you who may not know, RedR UK is an international NGO that trains and supports aid workers, organisations and communities around the world. We give them the skills and knowledge to prepare for and recover from disasters. So this year, 1 in 29 people across the globe are going to require humanitarian assistance. And it's a figure that's increasing year on year as a result of natural hazards, the effects of climate change, poverty and conflict. But some of you may be wondering how RedR UK fits into this picture and what work we actually do in disaster zones around the world, and how it benefits those in need and what can be achieved with the money raised by fundraisers such as yourselves. So we train savers, that's the kind of strapline. So it's a simple premise, right? But what does it mean in practice? So I'd like to thank everyone who's decided to join us for this webinar so I can show you a bit more about that. So in terms of a bit of context, so RedR UK was founded in 1980 by Peter Guthrie. He was a humanitarian engineer and he was working with the boat people in Vietnamese boat people, and he had a vision that we needed to have engineers that were deployed to emergencies, and so he created the Register of Engineers for Disaster Relief. So that's representing our engineering heritage. And it was that kind of understanding of engineers that were needed in the aftermath of a disaster, and so they have a very vital role to play both then and now. So for more than 4 decades, RedR UK has maintained strong links with the engineering sector, and to this day, some of our most generous and loyal supporters and corporate partners and fundraisers are part of the engineering world. These relationships have been essential to RedR's growth and our success over the years. And even now, at the beginning of Go Red Week, it's wonderful to see that continued support. So I thank you once more. With many engineering companies, I can see your faces here or your names here as well. So and choosing to get involved. So thank you for that. But while we're incredibly proud of our heritage, we can't deny that RedR UK has evolved over the years. It was the Register of Engineers for Disaster Relief, but the world has changed in the last 4 decades, and RedR UK has changed with it. In the past, RedR UK would deploy specialist humanitarians, often engineers, to disaster zones around the world to help save and build lives. And while that mission remains vitally important and physical deployments are sometimes still necessary, RedR UK now delivers online training training for aid workers all over the world. And that also represents a move to localization, where we're not able to kind of deploy, or it's not, shall we say, acceptable now, or it's less palatable now to deploy, someone from the global north to someone somewhere in the global south as a response to emergencies. So physical deployments are kind of not how we choose to do that, and we now deliver online training for aid workers all over the world. So this directly gives them the knowledge that they need to save and build lives in the aftermath of disasters. So we focus on training local and national aid workers because they're often the first responders in a crisis, and they're the first to assist when disaster strikes. And so we want to give them the skills to do their jobs effectively. So by providing the online training, we can ensure that no matter where in the world they are, so communities will be supported with trained aid workers in times of crisis. So our on-loan approach was first applied in earnest during the COVID-19 pandemic, as you can imagine. In response to the pandemic and the restrictions imposed, we had to rapidly scale up our online learning offers in order to support communities around the globe who were affected by COVID-19. So without the physical means to reach them, we transformed our approach to make our humanitarian support accessible and effective. So our COVID response trained over 3,000 individuals. That's no mean feat, including teachers, nurses, aid workers, and the general public in over 90 countries. So the reach was huge, really. So we're equipping them with the skills and knowledge they need to protect both themselves and vulnerable communities against the devastating effects of the pandemic. So with the support of our donors, we were able to offer this training to individuals at no charge, so completely free. And it's a great example of what can be achieved with the support of fundraisers and donors. But our achievements haven't been restricted to the COVID trainings. We're at the forefront of tackling some of the most pressing issues facing our world, including climate change. Across Asia and Africa, we've helped to build the resilience of communities at risk of the adverse effects of climate change, from drought, floods, typhoons, and other hazards. Communities are under threat. So climate change could displace more than 1 billion people by 2050. That's huge, and will affect every region in the world. So through our climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction program, we've delivered online training for local humanitarians, community leaders, government staff, and others in how best to prepare against climate-related hazards. So to date, we've focused on training individuals in the Philippines, Bangladesh, and East Africa, in regions often affected by the consequences of climate change. And so our CCADRR program, as we call it, CCADRR, nice acronym for you, has already trained hundreds of people, ensuring that a cohort of well-trained humanitarians are on standby in local communities to prepare for and respond to disasters whenever they occur. So as much as RedR UK focuses on long-term and protracted threats such as climate change, we are also a responsive humanitarian organisation in times of emergency. More than 1,000 miles away at the moment, RedR trained workers are on the ground responding to one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent years, the conflict in Ukraine. So RedR UK acted quickly in response to the events in Ukraine. In the opening weeks of the crisis, our staff and volunteers worked hard to develop a learning needs analysis, so to rapidly identify the skills which were most needed amongst local aid workers. And then following this, we created a series of online training modules based on that learning needs analysis. I can't even say that. Shouldn't be the CEO if I can't say learning needs analysis. So the topics range from like Anita's laughing, from topics ranging from gender-based violence, as we'll hear a bit more from later, to humanitarian ethics and project planning and coordination. And so we developed these courses in 4 languages. We've got Ukrainian, Polish, Romanian, and English. So we're definitely there to try and serve the local aid workers, local aid community. And in recent weeks, we've begun delivering these training courses for local responders in Eastern Europe. So as with our COVID response in 2020, the support of our donors has enabled us to deliver this training free of charge, with more than 11 people who have been forced to flee from their homes in Ukraine in one of the biggest refugee crises of modern times. That's a feat in itself, to kind of train those people who are going to be looking after the 11 million people who have been forced to flee. So the scale of the humanitarian crisis is staggering, but we'll continue to have a role to play. In addition to our current projects, we're exploring the possibility of introducing more on-site face-to-face training, which would allow more practical elements to be incorporated into our courses. We're also looking at structural assessment training for Ukraine as well, so to look at kind of conflict severity scale. So we're looking very much on an engineering and a post-conflict engineering tip for that as well. So we're also looking at the potential of enhancing the social integration of refugees via information and training support for both host families and displaced people. At the same time, we hope to recorrect with our engineering heritage by more, as I said, by more thoroughly exploring the potential of post-conflict engineering. So engineers are definitely essential in post-conflict contexts where they can help build infrastructure and communities. And at RedR UK, we've got extensive experience of working in such contexts. For instance, we've just finished the first stage of conducting training courses for local engineers in Iraq and Syria in conjunction with Rambo UK. We expect to run similar projects in UK depending how the conflict evolves. We are also exploring this possibility of setting up a bursary scheme for engineering students who have been forcibly displaced. Of course, as a charity, RedR's work is dependent on the support of its donors. I'm thankful to see many of you here today. The Go Red Week, new is not wear red anymore, even though we are wearing red, we're going red. And it's an exciting opportunity for offices all over the world to raise money for RedR while having fun in the process. So the goal of this year's campaign, as Anita said, is to raise £20,000 to support RedR UK and our humanitarian work. And we hope with your help that we can achieve this. So with 20 offices to support us, each pledging to raise about 1,000, we can easily reach our targets. But what can be achieved with 20,000? So that money could be used to support a variety of humanitarian projects around the globe. But for a frame of reference, 20,000 could allow us to run a 6-week climate change adaptation DRR training course for approximately 80 people. So a little really does go a long way. We're excited to see what new fundraising ideas you can come up with to help us reach this target, and we truly hope that you enjoy the week ahead. But at the same time, we must not forget the reason behind our fundraising efforts. From COVID to climate change to the conflict in Ukraine, millions of people around the world are in need of humanitarian assistance. And at RedR UK, we want to ensure that aid workers are trained and ready to meet those needs. Every penny raised will contribute towards our stated purpose to mitigate the impact of crisis on the most vulnerable people. Similarly to our CCA DRR courses, our training modules for Ukraine and other learning programs we run. This webinar today is free of charge. That said, if you feel our cause is worth supporting, we'd be grateful if you could consider donating today. And there's a website, I think it was up on the first link there. I hope you enjoy the Go Red Week, and I also hope that all the times you keep in mind our purpose and the humanitarian mission you are also all generously choosing to support. So thank you once again. That's me, stop talking, there we go.
Thank you, Jo, that was great. And now I will hand it over to Lee Ashley.
Thank you so much, Anita. I really appreciate that introduction before. I'll ask your assistants just to project the slides as I get started. I've been asked to give an overview of humanitarian response trends, as well as share personal reflections on being a humanitarian and being involved in RedR UK's work. So I'm really here today, if we could move to the first slide, please. Great, because I believe that humanitarian aid is essential for there to be any hope of justice, particularly for women and girls who have been affected by disasters. Now, I did not start my career as a humanitarian, but I was an academic researcher, and I worked initially with trials and truth commissions to support investigation into violations of international criminal law. So that's, for example, crimes against humanity and war crimes, among others. And as part of this work, I analyzed testimony and met many survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, torture, forced displacement, and other international crimes that all happened in the immediate wake of disasters. Then and now, I have witnessed firsthand how humanitarian work fulfills their primary aim to alleviate suffering. And the provision, for example, of psychological support at the right time by a trained frontline humanitarian worker can lead survivors of atrocities to a path of healing, which allows the pursuit of justice in a way that they choose and that is meaningful to them. Now, I've also seen, just as another example of humanitarian work, how simply providing transport to a survivor of atrocity to go to a health clinic can alleviate immediate physical and mental suffering. And I've also seen how providing shelter for a family, even just for one night, can prevent harm, not only to a survivor of atrocities, but to entire families. Unfortunately, I've also seen how the absence of humanitarian assistance prevents the possibility of meaningful justice. So without meeting the basic needs of food, water, shelter, all that infrastructure that engineers put in place during a disaster, to come and speak of international justice and that big concept can really seem cruel and farcical. So I just was going to share one example of a survivor I worked with who has moved and continues to motivate all that I do, because she participated both in trials and truth commissions, but still struggled daily for food and shelter, and struggled to get assistance for her child who suffered from malnutrition. So although my motivation for the past 2 decades to help pursue justice for survivors of gender-based violence has not changed, the way that I have pursued that goal has shifted. And now I primarily devote my time to humanitarian work, really to ensure that those frontline basic services are there from the start of any disaster, because I believe that is really the condition that is necessary for there to be a pursuit of justice, however long that may take, however imperfect that form of justice may be. So that's really just my glimpse. I was asked to give a personal story into being being a humanitarian worker means for me, and kind of this internal dialogue I have with myself. But I know that these are big words I'm throwing around, humanitarian and justice, and they mean different things to different people. And each of us has our own way of defining them and really figuring out why is it that we support humanitarian work. So I do hope at the end of the session that you would be willing to share some stories or examples of your motivations for supporting humanitarian work. Now let me shift to get to some basic information that might be interesting of how I see the field evolving and trends emerging at this time. And to do that, I'm actually going to ask that we do a poll, because I think that might be more fun than me just showing numbers on the screen. So just give me a moment and I'll launch the poll. And if we could move to the next slide, please, Anita. Super. Okay, great. So hopefully you can all see a poll on your screen. Please feel free. The answers are anonymous. No one knows what anyone is answering. And this is really just an exercise to provoke personal reflection and to help gauge what you might find surprising or interesting about the field at the moment. I see respondents. Excellent. Thank you for bringing those in. Great. Thank you. Good, good. Okay. Great. And it's nice to see the variety. These aren't easy questions. They're quite detailed. Thank you so much. Excellent. And while you're answering the poll, we'll just go ahead and get ready for the next part. Excellent. I see we've got quite a few responders coming in. Excellent. And if for any reason, again, you don't feel comfortable with the Zoom function, please feel free just to write down the answer for yourself on a piece of paper. That's fine. Excellent. Okay. I will stop the poll there just for time and move us on. Excellent. So we can see we have different answers. So for the first question, most people think it's more than 100. A large percent think it's more than 250 million people in need. And globally, we have mixed answers on the ratio of women and girls affected by sexual violence who are refugees. And then the funding gap, yep, we have a wide variety. It seems like probably the largest percent of you feel it might be more than US $5 billion. So stay tuned, we'll go over the answers. And I'll be looking forward to your reflections on that. So let me just move to the next slide after the polling one, Anita. And one more, please. Thank you. Super. All right. So now Joe has previewed some of these with also some really impressive numbers about how RedR is responding. But I'd really like to go into a bit more detail about those causes that she mentioned. So first of all, we know that right now, more than 296 million people in the world are in need of humanitarian assistance, and that's growing. That's a figure from March, and we expect that it will be more than 300 million by the end of the year if something drastic doesn't change. And as Joe mentioned, that's the trifecta of conflict, climate-related disasters, and the impact of COVID-19. And as also mentioned, those are really spiraling. It's an upward pace for the past 3 years, and really unprecedented levels of need. Now, I wanted to highlight among the people who are most in need are those who are internally displaced, which is now almost 1% of the world. And among those, children are particularly affected, as you can see. And another surprising figure may be of that 1%, more than 40% are not expected to be able to return home for political reasons, for climate-related reasons, among others. So that's really the effect of protracted displacement. Now, linked with displacement, which we haven't talked about yet, are really concerning rises in hunger and food insecurity. So that's really driving the core of the humanitarian needs at this time. And you can see 45 million people, and that's spread across 43 different countries being on the brink of famine. And this year, in 2021, it was quite significant that for the first time in humanitarian policy reporting and analysis, climate was being recognized as a driver of these food insecurity factors, whereas previously the focus has been primarily on conflict. So we're seeing different types of factors and recognition of the variety of causes of food insecurity. Now, globally, humanitarian agencies have estimated that at least $41 billion is needed in 2022 to meet just the most urgent of these needs. And by March, with Ukraine crisis, that had increased by 8%, so closer to $43 billion. And while there is growing and really needed attention on the Ukraine crisis, it is important to keep in mind that it's only one of the crises that's driving these tremendous needs. So for example, Afghanistan, Yemen, Myanmar, Sudan, Somalia, and other emergencies, particularly at the moment in Western Africa and Sahel, have equivalent and in most cases higher numbers of people in need and higher financial needs. And that's because of the protracted nature of those crises that have really depleted coping mechanisms. Next slide, please. Great. Great. So as you saw in the poll, among the needs really globally is that 1 out of 3 women in the world experience GBV. But what we know is when a disaster strikes, those rates increase and become even higher. And if we look only among refugee women affected by crises alone, it is 1 out of 5 refugee women who have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And this is an alarmingly high rate when we know that right now there's an estimated more than 8 million women and girls who are refugees. Now, the prevalence of sexual violence against women and girl refugees has been corroborated in a number of studies. For example, in 2020, Women for Refugee Women found in a study in the UK and Wales that 75% of refugee women they had interviewed were survivors of sexual violence. So that just gives a glimpse of the immediate impact of this issue and their very specific needs for support. Next slide, please. All right. So as you can see from this graph, there are huge gaps in our ability to meet these rising needs. So in 2021, only 46% of the required funding was received, and that is a gap of 20.5 billion. So that was one of the polling questions as well. And as of March this year, only 5% of the funding to assist people required has been received. So we're really working hard against that graph and the image that it portrays. So when I look at these numbers, I feel awe, I feel dismay, but I think most of all, I feel a real sense of urgency, looking at how much we need to do and with limited resources. So I would be very curious to learn from you your reactions to some of these figures, and would also like to know if you have questions. So please do feel free to put them in the chat box for our question and answer time later. And I'm going to share with you in the chat box now some resources if you want to explore this data a bit more and go deeper. There are resources there, and that's the sources for this research, but much, much more. Next slide, please. Great. So I don't want to leave you without hope, because I'm very hopeful and see many opportunities for us to do more and better. First of all, as humanitarians, we are getting better at predicting when and where disasters occur. So in the past 2 to 3 years, we're implementing forecast-based financing, which means we're initiating humanitarian action, putting in funding and programming before the crisis actually starts, for example, in climate-related crises. We're also better at collecting data to respond and adapt to the needs as they occur. So just look at the data hubs that I put in the chat box, and you'll see how the visibility of humanitarian response and the analysis has improved to make our decision-making better for affected populations. Now, local organizations, I don't think, are still receiving enough funding, but there is really a significant shift in the past few years. So for example, I've seen new modalities of funding where organizations that are women-led in context are earmarked for funding, particularly for gender-based violence. And we have new guidance that requires local leadership in our coordination structures. And this is a welcome change. And then I'd like to reflect a bit on what Joe discussed about technology and how those gaps have shrunk in terms of geography, particularly after COVID-19, because of remote training and remote deployments. And I can just give you a few examples of how we're reaching a much broader audience, and also people who were never reached before. So I've done coaching and monitoring programs. I've done entire training programs in Afghanistan and Yemen and Bangladesh, where women who could not move at all physically could attend these remote trainings. And that improved the quality of response, but it also was a way of meeting their basic rights at the same time in the crisis. So finally, in the past 2 years, we've seen incredible expressions and acts of solidarity, for example, in Ukraine and Afghanistan crises, and really seen how private citizens and networks who are providing finances and services that were not there before. And just as a few examples, we see diaspora networks playing a much greater role. In my field, translators or psychosocial counselors are now responding remotely in very insecure areas such as Myanmar or Afghanistan, and providing services and filling gaps that others cannot through these powerful remote networks of connecting. Now, there are challenges that accompany these opportunities with volunteers and solidarity. And that's if this kind of volunteerism occurs without training or working with coordination mechanisms and without knowledge of humanitarian principles. But organizations like RedR UK are helping direct the solidarity. And I've actually seen how it's providing a safe space and a platform for those interested in contributing to a response do so without doing any harm. Next slide, please. So what do I mean by this do no harm? Let me just give you a few examples. So in the past 5 years, there have been really significant shifts in policy and resources to ensure that interventions do no harm, meaning that its humanitarian aid is not exposing people to risks by taking action. So in my field, for example, do no harm means preventing gender-based violence from occurring, and that includes preventing gender-based violence from including perpetrated by humanitarians themselves. It also means making sure that older persons, persons with disabilities, and marginalized populations receive assistance in a non-discriminatory manner. And since 2015, our humanitarian policy-making body, the Interagency Standing Committee, has mandated that all humanitarians work to do no harm and prevent gender-based violence. So that changed because it's not just protection actors or specialists like myself, but it is water, food, shelter, engineers, logisticians, procurement officers who are now engaging in do no harm programming and actions, including gender-based violence risk mitigation. And I think it's really important, and I've wanted to be part of it, because for me, this is actually a capacity building and skill building problem, not a resource building problem. So in other words, we're improving how humanitarian aid is delivered, water, shelter, food. And that's what avoids gender-based violence from occurring, or also prepares for response when it does, that's safe and efficient and empowering for survivors. Next slide, please. So let me just give you one example here on the screen. This is from the Ukraine training we're doing with responders now. So you'll see there is a photo of a young girl. This is from inside Ukraine, walking in an area that appears to have been bombed alone and quite isolated. So in our trainings, participants who are local responders look at this and analyze what the risks are in the environment. And then they think about and we discuss how they can actually change that environment. So just a few examples of the kind of ideas that they've had. And I've also already seen from various groups that I'm on, some of which are being implemented, is that they're mapping routes, for example, with local organizations or education actors to know where are the safe places to move to and from schools and other essential facilities. They've also discussed how to put into place humanitarian accompaniment programs. So for example, groups of humanitarian or civilian groups accompanying civilians, particularly children, to and from public places. Some of our participants in training discussed awareness campaigns. Some they had started with parents, for example, and educating them on how to mitigate the risk of separation and evacuation and other different aspects of the crisis, and also doing civil and military outreach and working with mine action actors to reduce the risks in this environment. So in other words, in these trainings, I'm seeing education, logistics, mine action, and other professionals really take this example and immediately begin to apply it. So the process of saving lives is actually beginning in this training space. And that's important for me because if people can't look at this photo and identify what the risks are for this young girl, then there's no way we can prevent them. And RedR is really giving this opportunity to discuss and identify those risks and act to stop them from occurring. Next slide, please. So finally, I wanted to explain that what I'm observing in the RedR UK trainings, specifically for Ukraine, is going beyond that skill building. And I'm also seeing solidarity and action. So just as an example, 1 week ago, we had frontline responders from women's group, some of which were in Poland and some were in Ukraine on the same training platform. And during the exercise I just showed you, they started sending each other messages in the chat box, emojis, and explaining how they wanted to support each other. And they also started exchanging lesson learned and experiences about what's working for them both across both borders. And I really saw that as problem solving, but it's also peer support because they're local responders in one country supporting other local responders through coaching, empowerment, and just helping them sustain the response that requires so many of us to be present in so many different ways. So the impact of that training is very real, I think, for them. I think it's real for the communities affected because they can implement that knowledge, and it's real for me as a trainer as well. So despite the soaring numbers that we've talked about and that you explored through the poll today, I still have incredibly high hopes. I know the participants in the trainings have high hopes from what I've observed. And I think that RedR is really giving the tools for people to respond. And that makes me excited about being a humanitarian every day. So I think I'll leave it there for now and then hand back to you, Joe, and Anita for any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Lee. Ashley, that was really, really interesting. We still have a few more minutes for the Q&As. So if you would like to either post them in the chat box or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Do we have any questions? Yeah, somebody's. No, it doesn't. It doesn't seem like we've got any questions. Well, in that case, I would like to thank you all for joining us today and taking part in this week's Go Red for RedR UK. And I'd like to thank you for your time. We hope that you enjoyed today's session. And once again, please support our work, support our Go Red campaign, and donate now. There is the QR code on the slide at the moment, so to make it really easy for you, or you can go on our Infuse page and look for your theme and add to their score. I think we actually have one question from Gareth. Is there any practical advice for engaging with Ukrainian engineers? That would be a question for either Joe or Lee Ashley. I'm not really sure that we still got Joe on the. I think we might have lost Joe.
I might be able to provide one suggestion. I'm not an engineer, but there are sites run by OCHA and also by UNHCR, similar to what I showed you earlier, that we should be able to share. And that has information about different NGOs working in the response, as well as different clusters. So for example, depending on what kind of engineer you may be able to connect with organizations that you see listed there, or also find ways to support them directly through looking at those pages. So if you give me a few moments, I'll just put in the links to the chat to some of those basic information pages for Ukraine response, which might be helpful.
And I think Jo is back on call now, and she might be able to help as well. So Jo, we have a question from Gareth. Is there any practical advice for engaging with Ukrainian engineers?
That's a good question. So we had a meeting earlier on today, actually, with the Institution of Chemical Engineers, and they said that the Refugee Employment Network, that they'd been in touch with, so Prince Charles had been looking at, you know, basically something through the Refugee Employment Network. So I'm wondering whether that's a good opportunity or an option for people to kind of approach them and then see if there are any engineers amongst them. That's potential. Bath University is the I don't know what its official title, but it's the University for Refugees. So again, that again is a potential avenue for finding out about Ukrainian engineers. Who else did I see? Someone else has said about supporting Ukrainian universities. So not for Ukrainian engineers to study here, because that would kind of I can find out that for you as well. I'm sure I saw an email about it. There was someone supporting, or an organization supporting Ukrainian universities. So if that's the case, then I can probably get the name of those universities as well.
Thank you, Jo. We have another question from Brad. Question, do you have a system for capturing, developing and adopting lessons learned product ideas? Again, I think that's probably, Jo, best question for you.
So all of our ideas we have about products probably get stored on what's called as our FOUT, the Forward Outlook Restricted Table. And that's the kind of where we kind of dump all the ideas about work that we might be talking about with people, you know, so the concept around post-conflict engineering, and we would put that on there, and you can talk about then, you know, what it's about and who we would approach and potential collaborators on that. So we do keep that way. Hold on, I'm going back to the question again. So the lessons learned is an ongoing process, really. And so we get lessons learned after every training course we do, because obviously we get feedback. We get quite real-time feedback, and so we'll always, you know, make those changes. And, you know, as much as we've done a learning needs analysis for the start of the Ukraine response, we did one for the COVID response, we always do a follow-up, and then we'll do a pilot first, and so we capture those lessons from that, and then change, amend the course, and then deliver it as in a better form. And then we take any learning from that as well, and can also adapt. And an example of that would be in the COVID response we did. Funnily enough, people wanted to understand more about how to do remote management in COVID, and then once that was done, they said, yeah, that was great, an introduction, we now want one that's more advanced. So we then kind of adapted and changed, and we developed from that. So it's a lesson in some ways, saying people, you're taking people's ideas and being accountable to your clients, in this case the learners, really. I hope that helps or answers.
Thank you, Jo. We have another question from George. Is there anything early career professionals can do to assist with humanitarian aid from a technical perspective?
Okay. It's a hard sector to get into, and that's what we know is, you know, and everyone says that. And there's an element of we often, I'm trying to put this in a tactful way as well. I mean, it's unfair in some ways to look at beneficiaries and then have early career professionals maybe who have not necessarily deployed before and have not operated in that environment. And so it's a real kind of a trade-off then, and then it's the catch-22, I guess, in if you don't have an experience, how do you get into that? We are relaunching our affiliate scheme, and then that will be providing with there will be a mentor element within that. So that's one way that technical professionals can do so. There are lots of other networks as well, you know, lots of LinkedIn networks that you could sign up to as well that could help, you know, that kind of transition, I guess. Other technical perspective or technical input could be through something like Knowledge Point. And we may have talked about that before, where people answer questions or people post questions online, and most predominantly at the moment it's on water, sanitation and hygiene. And then we have people who can, you know, provide their input to say, actually, you might want to consider this or X, Y, and Z. So for deployment, very few, I think, early professionals, unless you've managed to break into the organization, into the world already, but there might be more remotely.
Thank you, Jo. I think we have time. Well, we're already running out of time, but we have time for one more question. Question from Holly. Why is funding so low? Do you analyze the reasons?
I can start with that one. Yes, well, let me nuance that a bit. In some countries, funding has retracted, particularly with COVID and competing priorities for domestic response. But also there have been some crises, including Ukraine and Afghanistan, where actually giving has been quite substantial, but it's simply not keeping pace with the needs. I mean, the scale of crises we're dealing with is just really astounding, and it's that compound effect. So the funding in itself isn't necessarily so low in all cases, but it's so low compared to the scale of needs. So I think for me, that's one of the primary reasons. But Jo, please feel free to come in with other reasons as well from your perspective.
Why is funding so low? I mean, protracted crises, obviously, you know, it's just not at the forefront of everyone's brain, and so funds are low on those. There is obviously less funding around at the moment, specifically from us and the British government, and there's a lot less funding around as well, and that obviously has its impact. I think that there's only so much, you know, donors can do, and I think the humanitarian system tends to lurch from one sexy emergency to another, you know, the Ukraine crisis being a sexy emergency that gathers everyone's, you know, the way that humanitarian works is that, you know, something like this happens on the whole world. The whole humanitarian world seems to pivot to that response, meaning that everything else doesn't, you know, gets a look in. And even down to us ourselves, as you know, as a small organization, there's only so much we can do to, you know, in each of those kind of environments. So I'm, for example, trying to work with Aimal, who's a volunteer who works for us, and he is Afghan and used to work for the UN, and we're now working out how to kind of, you know, what we can do in terms of, you know, working for Afghanistan. But it's just, you know, it seems that a lot of that has been forgotten because Ukraine is on our back step.
Anita, maybe if I could also respond to the earlier question about what early career professionals can do. One thing you can do is advocate for humanitarian work and taking this information we discussed today and sharing that with others. And I know a lot of the humanitarian clusters increasingly are reaching out and would like the support of young career professionals in advocacy campaigns for humanitarian response. So that's one option certainly available. Over.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that's all that we have time for now. Once again, thank you for joining us. Please remember to support our campaign, to support our work. We suggested donation is £5. You got a QR code on the screen right now. You probably got invites to all our various events that are happening this week. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your support, and have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the RedR team that put this on.
Thank you.